The Gentleman's Traverse, a novel. Chapter 1, in which an experiment is conducted with unintended success. The rain had been falling on Clerkenwell for 3 days straight, which was neither unusual nor particularly noteworthy, except that Mr. Aldrich Pemberton had run out of Earl Grey that morning and found himself in rather poor spirits as a result. He stood beneath his black umbrella at the corner of Farringdon Road, watching a newspaper tumble past in the grey drizzle, and reflected that London in November was much like London in October, which was itself indistinguishable from London in March. The city possessed a steadfast commitment to dampness that he found almost admirable. His cane, a rather fine piece of Malaysian blackwood with a silver handle shaped like a sleeping fox, tapped against the pavement as he waited for a gap in the motor traffic. It was this cane, inherited from a peculiar uncle who'd spent his later years cataloguing door knockers across 7 counties, that had prompted this morning's idle thought. Uncle Septimus had been convinced, in the way that elderly academics sometimes are, that knocking possessed a certain significance. Not the mere courtesy of announcing one's presence, but something older, more fundamental. He'd filled 3 leather journals with sketches of door knockers, accompanied by increasingly cryptic notes about thresholds and the spaces between. Aldrich had inherited both the cane and the journals, though he'd only skimmed the latter. Uncle Septimus had been brilliant, certainly, but also quite mad. Still, the thought had lodged itself in his mind over breakfast. What if one could simply knock and go elsewhere? It was the sort of whimsical notion that occurs to everyone occasionally, usually while stuck in particularly tedious meetings or waiting for particularly slow trains. The fantasy of escape, polite and immediate. The traffic cleared. Aldrich stepped off the curb, and because he was the sort of man who, when struck by an amusing thought, sometimes acted upon it purely to see what would happen, he stopped in the middle of the crossing, raised his cane, and rapped it smartly against the wet pavement. "Well then," he said, in the quietly conversational tone one might use to address a cat, "send me to another world." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground opened beneath him like a trapdoor that had always been there, waiting. He fell politely, umbrella still raised, through a space that was neither dark nor light, but rather absent, as though reality had simply declined to render the scenery between one place and another. His primary thought, in the brief interval of falling, was that he should have been more specific about which other world. His secondary thought was that he'd left his hat at home. His tertiary thought was interrupted by the ground arriving to meet him, though it did so with unexpected courtesy, depositing him in a standing position on what appeared to be grass. Aldrich blinked. The rain had stopped. The traffic had vanished. Clerkenwell Road had been replaced by a meadow of such aggressive greenness that it seemed almost impolite, dotted with flowers in colours that he suspected didn't technically exist in London's usual spectrum. The sky was the wrong shape. He couldn't quite put his finger on how it was the wrong shape. The geometry seemed sound at first glance, but there was something subtly angular about the way the clouds sat in it, as though they'd been placed there by someone who'd read a description of clouds but never actually seen one. "Ah," said Aldrich. He lowered his umbrella, which was now quite unnecessary, and considered his situation. He appeared to be standing on a stone path that wound through the meadow toward what might generously be called a village, a collection of cottages with thatched roofs and walls in soft pastels. Smoke rose from several chimneys in geometrically perfect spirals. A butterfly the size of a dinner plate drifted past, its wings making a sound like wind chimes. Aldrich watched it go, then looked down at his cane. "I don't suppose," he said to it, "you'd care to explain yourself?" The cane, naturally, did not respond. The silver fox at its head continued to sleep, as it had for the past 40 years. He became aware, then, of a weight that hadn't been there before. Not on his person, exactly, but somehow adjacent to his person. He reached up automatically and found that he was, in fact, wearing a hat. A rather fine silk top hat that he was absolutely certain he hadn't put on that morning. When he removed it to examine it, something in his mind clicked softly into place, like a drawer closing in a very well-made cabinet. He knew, with the sudden clarity of instinct, that the hat was not merely a hat, It was a space, a small, folded pocket of elsewhere that he could, if he wished, place things into. He tested this hypothesis by thinking firmly about his umbrella, which promptly vanished from his hand and appeared in the hat, though the hat showed no sign of containing anything at all. "How curious," Aldrich murmured. He thought about the umbrella again, and it reappeared in his hand, completely dry. This was, he reflected, either evidence that he'd suffered a complete psychotic break, or that Uncle Septimus had been more right than anyone had given him credit for. A third option, that both things were simultaneously true, seemed worth considering. He replaced the hat on his head and began walking toward the village, cane tapping against the stone path. As he walked, he noticed that each thing he looked at seemed to acquire a small, neat label in his mind. Not visibly, he wasn't hallucinating floating text, thank goodness, but conceptually. Grass, common meadow flora, variant unknown, edibility uncertain. Path, stone, paved, approximately 200 years old. Destination, inhabited settlement. Sky, non-Euclidean. Recommend avoiding prolonged observation. He stopped looking at the sky. The village, as he approached it, proved to be both occupied and quiet. People moved between the cottages, people who were mostly human-shaped, though several had qualities that suggested human was perhaps more of a guidelines than a rule. A woman hanging washing had rather too many fingers. A man repairing a roof possessed eyes that tracked independently, like a chameleon's. No one seemed particularly alarmed by Aldrich's arrival. A child, definitely human, or near enough, was playing with a wooden sword near the path. He looked up as Aldrich approached and tilted his head. "Are you lost, mister?" the child asked. "Comprehensively," Aldrich admitted, "though I'm not entirely certain one can be properly lost if one has no idea where one intended to be." The child processed this. "That's stupid." "I quite agree. Could you tell me what this place is called?" "Millbrook," the child said, as though this were obvious. "Are you from the capital?" "London," Aldrich said, "though I suspect that's not a nearby option." "Never heard of it," the child said cheerfully, and returned to his sword practice. Aldrich continued into the village proper, where he discovered a square containing a well, a notice board covered in papers he couldn't read, and what appeared to be an inn. The sign above the door depicted a sleeping cat curled around a crescent moon. The drowsy Mauser, his new mental labeling system supplied. Establishment, inn and tavern, threat level low, ale quality uncertain. He'd never asked for a threat assessment before. The fact that his mind was now providing them seemed worthy of note. The door of the inn opened before he could knock, which was probably for the best, all things considered, and a woman emerged. She was tall, grey-haired, and possessed the sort of face that suggested she'd seen most things, and hadn't been particularly impressed by any of them. "You'll be wanting a room," she said. It wasn't a question. "I rather think I might," Aldrich agreed, "though I'm afraid I'm not certain about my means of payment." The woman's eyes moved to his hat, then to his cane, then back to his face. Something shifted in her expression, not quite alarm, but a careful sort of attention. "You've the look of someone who's knocked on the wrong door," she said quietly. "Or possibly the right one," Aldrich replied. "I'm still determining which." She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "First night's free," she said, "for travellers of your particular inclination. After that, we'll discuss terms." Aldrich touched the brim of his hat in thanks and stepped inside. The common room was warm, low-ceilinged, and smelled of wood smoke and something cooking that might have been a stew. 3 patrons sat at separate tables, each carefully not looking at him with the intensity of people who were absolutely looking at him. The woman gestured to the stairs. "Third door on the left. Supper's at 7. If you've got questions, save them for after you've eaten. You look like you've had the sort of day that requires a meal before philosophy." "Madam," said Aldrich, "you are disconcertingly perceptive." "I keep an inn in a border village," she replied. "Comes with the territory." She returned to the bar, leaving Aldrich to climb the narrow stairs to his room. It was small, clean, and contained a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the meadow. The wrongly shaped sky was beginning to dim into evening, though the colours it chose for sunset were not ones Aldrich had previously associated with the process. He sat on the bed, which was comfortable enough, and removed his hat, setting it carefully on the small table. Then he looked at his cane. "Well," he said, "this is all your fault, I hope you realize." The silver fox continued sleeping. Aldrich sighed, removed his coat, and lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. Somewhere outside, someone was playing a flute. The melody was pleasant but structured incorrectly, as though the musician had learned music from a book that was missing every third page. He should, he reflected, be more alarmed. He should be panicking, demanding answers, attempting to reverse what he'd done. Instead, he found himself thinking about his empty flat in Clerkenwell, his cancelled afternoon appointment with the dentist, and his morning routine that had been identical for the past 7 years. "Well," he said to the ceiling, "at least it's not raining." The ceiling, like the cane, offered no response. Aldrich closed his eyes and, despite everything, found himself drifting towards sleep. His last conscious thought was that tomorrow he should probably try to understand what exactly he'd done, and perhaps more importantly, whether he could do it again. Chapter 2, in which geography becomes a matter of courtesy. Aldrich woke to sunlight that was the wrong colour, a sort of honey gold that seemed too thick, as though one could spread it on toast, and lay still for a moment, cataloguing his situation. He was in an unfamiliar room. He was in an unfamiliar world. He had apparently acquired the ability to knock on things and create doors to places that shouldn't be accessible via doors. All things considered, he felt remarkably well rested. He sat up, and his new mental labelling system helpfully informed him that the bed was cottage standard, moderately comfortable, approximately 15 years old, no threat detected. This was both useful and slightly intrusive, rather like having a very thorough but uninvited butler living in one's head. His top hat sat on the bedside table where he'd left it. His cane leaned against the wall, the silver fox still dozing peacefully. Aldrich retrieved both, settled the hat on his head, and paused. A thought had occurred to him, the sort of thought that arrives fully formed, as though it had been waiting patiently in the queue behind more immediate concerns. His grandson, Timothy, had been quite enthusiastic about something he'd called isekai last Christmas. Aldrich hadn't paid tremendous attention to the explanation. Something about people being transported to other worlds, often from books or games. Timothy had rattled off several titles with the breathless enthusiasm of the young, most of which had blurred together in Aldrich's memory. Except one. Laurendale. The name had stuck, possibly because Timothy had been reading the novel at the dinner table, despite his mother's protests. Something about a kingdom, wasn't it? Magic and adventurers and the sort of organized fantasy that came with guilds and quests. Aldrich looked at his cane thoughtfully. "I don't suppose," he said, "you'd care to take me to Laurendale?" The fox slept on. Aldrich sat on the edge of the bed, positioned his cane carefully, and, feeling only slightly ridiculous, tapped it smartly against the mattress. "Take me to Laurendale," he said, in the same polite tone one might use to hail a cab. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he felt it, a responding tap from beneath the bed, as though something underneath were knocking back. The mattress lurched. Aldrich had just enough time to think, "Oh dear," before the entire bed, blankets and all, flipped itself over like a particularly athletic pancake. He tumbled through a space that was neither up nor down, still lying on bedding that had apparently decided to come along for the journey, and landed with surprising gentleness on another bed entirely. This one was considerably more luxurious. Aldrich blinked at an unfamiliar ceiling, painted a pleasant beige with pink trim, and slowly sat up. The room was markedly different from the one he'd fallen asleep in, larger, better appointed. A delicate teapot sat on a table beside a window hung with lace curtains, and the morning light coming through it was the correct colour, which was almost disappointing. "Well," Aldrich said to his cane, which he'd somehow managed to keep hold of during the transition. "Where did you take me this time?" The fox continued its eternal nap. Outside he could hear sounds, carriage wheels on cobblestones, voices calling to one another, the general bustle of a proper town. It was markedly different from the quiet village he'd left behind. Room, in accommodation, superior quality. Occupancy, paid through current night. Location, Laurendale, Central District. Aldrich stood, straightened his waistcoat, and placed his top hat firmly on his head. Whatever was happening, it seemed to respond better to a degree of formality. He made his way downstairs, cane tapping on steps that his mental butler informed him were oak, well-maintained, approximately 30 years old. The ground floor opened into a considerably busier common room than the Drowsy Mouser had possessed. A dozen patrons sat at various tables, eating breakfast and conducting quiet conversations. Behind a polished counter, a woman with efficiently pinned-back hair was reviewing a ledger. She looked up as Aldrich approached. "Good morning, sir. Your room has been paid for through the night. Will you be checking out?" Aldrich considered this. He had no money, at least none that would be recognized here. Extending his stay seemed impractical, even if he'd wanted to. "I think I shall be checking out, yes," he said. The woman produced a form and a pen. "If you could just sign here, please." Aldrich signed his name in his usual neat script, Aldrich W. Pemberton. The woman glanced at it, made a small notation in her ledger, and nodded. "Safe travels, Mr. Pemberton." "Thank you kindly." He stepped out into the street and stopped to take stock. Lorrendale, if this was indeed that place, was considerably more urban than Millbrook had been. Proper cobbled streets, buildings of 3 and 4 stories, people in what appeared to be a combination of medieval and vaguely Victorian dress. The architecture suggested a city that couldn't quite decide which century it belonged to and had opted for several at once. The wrongly shaped sky was absent, replaced by ordinary clouds and ordinary blue, which was almost more unsettling. It suggested that whatever he'd done with his cane could traverse not just distance, but entire cosmologies. A gentleman in a brown coat hurried past, and Aldrich, operating on the principle that one should gather information when lost, called out, "Pardon me, could you tell me how one might earn money in this fair city?" The man paused, looking slightly harried. "Sell something, work a trade, or register with the Adventurers Guild. That's the usual routes." He tipped his hat and continued on his way. Adventurers Guild. Timothy had mentioned those. Organizations that coordinated monster hunting, dungeon exploration, and the general sort of dangerous employment that fantasy worlds seemed to require. Aldrich had never hunted a monster in his life. The most dangerous thing he'd encountered in London was a particularly aggressive goose in Hyde Park. Still, if this was a hallucination, and the possibility remained that he was currently unconscious in a hospital bed somewhere, his body broken by a wayward motorcar, he might as well see it through properly. He stopped a woman carrying a basket of apples. "The Adventurers Guild. Could you point me in the right direction?" She gave him an odd look, her eyes traveling from his top hat down to his polished shoes. 3 streets that way, large building with the crossed swords. Can't miss it. Much obliged. The guild was indeed impossible to miss. A substantial stone building with an elaborate sign depicting crossed swords over what appeared to be a stylized dragon. Aldrich paused at the entrance, suddenly aware that he had no idea what he was doing. He pushed the door open anyway. The interior was larger than the exterior had suggested, another bit of spatial oddness that he was beginning to accept as normal, and filled with people. Adventurers, presumably. They ranged from the armed and armored to the robed and mysterious, gathered in small groups around a notice board or clustered at various tables. Every single one of them straightened slightly as Aldrich entered. The room didn't fall silent, exactly, but the quality of the background noise changed. Conversations became quieter. People turned to look. Aldrich felt rather like he'd walked into the wrong party. He approached the main desk, where a young woman with her hair in a severe bun was organizing papers. She looked up, and her expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and finally something approaching alarm. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," she said in a lowered voice, "but nobility isn't permitted to register as adventurers. Guild regulations." Aldrich blinked. "I'm not noble." "Sir, you're clearly a common man," Aldrich continued politely. "I've always been a common man. I'm from England, which I suspect doesn't feature prominently in your local geography." She looked him up and down with deep suspicion. His tailored coat, his silk top hat, his polished cane with its silver fox, none of it was helping his case. "Your name, sir?" "Aldrich Pemberton." She considered this, her brow furrowed. "That's not a noble name." "I should hope not. My father was an accountant." The woman wavered visibly, caught between her instincts and the evidence. Finally, she sighed and produced a form. "Very well, Mr. Pemberton. If you'll just fill this out, we can begin the registration process." The form was mercifully straightforward: name, age, previous occupation, known skills. Aldrich filled it in honestly. He had no combat experience, no magical training, no particular expertise in anything that seemed relevant to adventuring. What he did have, he realized, were two rather unusual abilities that he was only beginning to understand. The woman, her nameplate read Helena Frost, registration clerk, reviewed his form with increasing bewilderment. "Mr. Pemberton, you haven't listed any skills." "I'm still determining what they are," Aldrich admitted. "It's been rather a strange few days." Helena pinched the bridge of her nose. "Right. Well, new adventurers typically start with gathering quests. Simple, low risk. There's one currently available. We need someone to collect Canolia flowers from the Margrave Mountains. Pink and black petals, used in healing potions. 10 flowers, standard gathering fee." She handed him a small card with the quest details written on it. Quest, Canolia Collection. Location, Margrave Mountains, western face. Reward, 50 silver pieces. "The mountains are about a day's journey west," Helena continued. "You'll want to hire a cart, or—" "That won't be necessary," Aldrich said absently, studying the card. "Thank you, Miss Frost. You've been tremendously helpful." He turned and walked back out into the street, leaving Helena staring after him with the expression of someone who suspected they'd made a terrible mistake, but couldn't quite identify what it was. Outside, Aldrich turned down a side street, then into an alley between two shops. Narrow, quiet, and importantly, unobserved. He looked at his cane. "Margrave Mountains," he said. "Western face, specifically, if you'd be so kind." He tapped the cobblestones. The ground opened beneath him, a polite little trapdoor in reality, and he fell through the space between places. This time he was ready for it. The sense of directionless motion, the absence of scenery, the peculiar feeling of being in transit without actually moving. He tumbled, rotated, and landed on his feet on rocky ground, slightly out of breath but otherwise unharmed. The Margrave Mountains rose around him, grey stone and hardy scrub, with peaks disappearing into low cloud. The air was thinner here, crisp and cold, and directly in front of him, growing from a crack in the rocks, was a cluster of flowers with pink and black petals that seemed to shimmer slightly in the morning light. Canolia, rare healing herb. Magical properties, moderate. Current specimens, 12 visible. "Well," said Aldrich, "that was efficient." He knelt carefully, mindful of his knees, and began to pick the flowers. They came away easily, their stems soft and slightly warm to the touch. He placed them carefully in his top hat, which he discovered could store things without crushing them, a useful feature, and paused. He'd completed the quest in approximately 3 minutes, including travel time. That seemed, somehow, like cheating. On the other hand, he'd been given no rules about how to complete the quest, only that it needed completing. Aldrich picked 2 more flowers for good measure, then stood and surveyed the mountains. He could see the path that ordinary adventurers would have taken, a winding trail up from the valley below, several hours of hiking at least. A bird he didn't recognize circled overhead, calling out in a voice that sounded almost like words. His mental labeling system informed him that it was a dire raven, scavenger, potentially dangerous in groups, current threat, minimal. The world, he was learning, was full of things that required labels. He should return to the guild, he supposed. Turn in the flowers, collect his payment, and begin to understand how this new life, hallucination, coma dream, or otherwise, actually functioned. But something made him pause. He was standing on a mountain in another world, having travelled there by knocking on the ground. He possessed a hat that could store items in a space that didn't exist, and a cane that could apparently open doors to anywhere. Surely there was more to understand before he went back. Aldrich sat down on a convenient boulder, removed his hat, and withdrew one of the Canolia flowers to examine it more closely. The petals were softer than they looked, and the black portion seemed to absorb light rather than merely reflecting it darkly. When he held it up to the sun, he could see tiny veins of something luminous running through the pink areas. Magical, his internal butler had said. He wondered what that actually meant. The dire raven landed on a rock nearby and cocked its head at him, one eye fixing him with what seemed like intelligent curiosity. "Good morning," Aldrich said politely. The raven made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been entirely coincidental. Aldrich returned the flower to his hat and settled in to think. He had knocked on a bed and travelled to a different city. He had knocked on cobblestones and travelled to a mountain. The ability, Uncle Septimus had apparently called it something in those journals, though Aldrich couldn't quite remember what, seemed to respond to intention as much as action. Answered knock. The phrase arrived in his mind fully formed, pulled from a memory of skimming through his uncle's increasingly incomprehensible notes. Threshold courtesy in the older texts. The ability to open doors where none existed, provided one asked properly. Aldrich looked at his cane, at the sleeping silver fox. "Did Uncle Septimus know?" he asked it quietly. "Is that why he gave this to me?" The fox, as always, provided no answers. A breeze picked up, carrying the scent of mountain herbs and something else, something that pinged his internal labeling system as magical residue. Source unknown, age recent. Aldrich stood, brushed off his trousers, and placed his hat back on his head. He would return to the guild. He would turn in his quest. And then perhaps he would begin to experiment properly with what he could do. After all, if one was going to be trapped in another world, accidentally or otherwise, one might as well understand the rules. Or failing that, learn how to politely ignore them. Chapter 2, in which geography becomes a matter of courtesy. Part 2. The journey back to Lorendale was considerably less dramatic than the journey out had been. Aldrich simply tapped his cane against the mountainside, thought firmly about the alley he'd departed from, and stepped through the resulting door as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He emerged from between two buildings, precisely where he'd left, straightened his hat, and made his way back to the guild. The common room was busier now, filled with the lunch crowd. Aldrich navigated between tables of armoured individuals discussing what sounded like professional violence, and returned to Helena's desk. She looked up, saw him, and blinked. "Mr. Pemberton, that was remarkably quick." "The flowers were exactly where you said they'd be," Aldrich replied, removing his hat and withdrawing the 12 camellia blossoms. They emerged perfectly preserved, not a petal crushed. "I hope these are satisfactory." Helena stared at the flowers, then at Aldrich, then back at the flowers. "You went to the Margrave Mountains and back in under an hour." "I'm an efficient traveller," Aldrich said mildly. She counted the flowers with visible suspicion, found nothing wrong with them, and produced a small leather pouch from beneath her desk. 50 silver pieces, as agreed. The coins clinked pleasantly as she counted them out. Aldrich accepted the pouch and hefted it experimentally. "If I might ask," he said, "could you explain the monetary system? I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the exchange rates." Helena looked at him as though he'd just admitted to not understanding which way was up. "You don't know the currency?" "I'm from quite far away," Aldrich reminded her. She sighed. 100 copper coins make 1 silver. 1,000 silver make 1 gold. 100 gold make 1 large gold coin. 100 large gold make 1 platinum. She paused. 50 silver is, well, it's enough for a few days' lodging and meals, not a fortune. Aldrich did the mental arithmetic. If he converted to what he'd known in America, where he'd worked for the better part of his career before retiring to London, this was roughly equivalent to having a few dollars, perhaps 2 or 3 at most. "I see," he said. "Thank you for clarifying." He pocketed the coins and considered his next move. He had abilities that seemed quite powerful, but he didn't fully understand how they worked or what their limitations were. "Miss Frost," he said, "is there somewhere one might receive training? I'm still learning what I'm capable of." Helena's expression shifted to something almost sympathetic. "Basement level. Training halls. Marcus and Elaine run the combat instruction, and they can help you sort out your abilities." "Much obliged." Aldrich found the stairs and descended into a large, open space divided into practice areas. Straw dummies stood at one end, archery targets at another, and several magic circles were painted on the floor in what looked like chalk mixed with something luminous. A broad-shouldered man in practical leather armor and a woman in mage's robes were observing a young adventurer attempt to set fire to a target. The fire kept going out. Aldrich approached and cleared his throat politely. "Excuse me," Helena Frost suggested you might be able to help me understand my abilities. The man, Marcus, presumably, turned and looked Aldrich up and down. What's your skill set? Well, Aldrich said, I appear to be able to knock on surfaces and create doors to other locations, and I have a hat that stores items in a space that doesn't technically exist. Both trainers stared at him. Right, said the woman, Elaine, slowly. Show us. Aldrich positioned his cane and tapped it smartly against the stone floor. Take me to the marketplace, he said clearly. Nothing happened. He frowned and tried again, this time with more intention. Take me to the Margrave Mountains. The floor remained stubbornly solid. Marcus and Elaine exchanged a look. Aldrich reached up and removed his hat, thinking about the camellia flowers he'd stored earlier. He reached inside, expecting to withdraw one. His hand met only empty air. He tried to activate his mental labeling system, focusing on Marcus's sword. Nothing appeared in his mind. No helpful text, no threat assessment, nothing. Aldrich trailed off, suddenly aware of how ridiculous he must look. I apologize. It appears I've made a mistake. Elaine's expression had shifted from curiosity to pity. It happens to new adventurers sometimes. The stress, the excitement, they think they have abilities they don't. There's no shame in it. Of course, Aldrich said, feeling his face warm slightly. Thank you for your time. He retreated back up the stairs with as much dignity as he could muster, which wasn't much. At Helena's desk, he paused only long enough to collect another quest, something simple to restore his confidence. Hunting wild pigs, 4 of them, within 48 hours. 20 silver pieces. He took the quest card and headed not for the front door, but for the back exit that led to the alley behind the guild. Once alone in the narrow space between buildings, Aldrich stared at his cane. What, he said quietly, was that about? He positioned himself carefully, raised the cane, and tapped it against the brick wall. A door appeared. Not metaphorically, an actual wooden door materialized in the brick, complete with a brass handle and hinges that looked centuries old. Aldrich stared at it for a long moment, then grasped the handle and pulled. The door opened onto forest. Tall trees, dappled sunlight, the sound of birds that might or might not be dangerous. He stepped through. The transition was different this time. Instead of falling, he simply walked forward and found himself stepping out from between 2 trees. The bark didn't split or crack. It rippled like water as he passed through, then solidified behind him. He turned to look, but the door had vanished. The tree trunk was whole and unbroken, as though nothing had disturbed it. Aldrich stood very still, thinking. His abilities had failed utterly in front of the trainers. But here, alone, they worked perfectly. Maybe, he said aloud, I'm not allowed to show people what I can do. It made a strange sort of sense. Magic that worked only in private, that refused to perform for an audience. Perhaps these were powers meant for him alone, personal rather than demonstrable. He looked down at his cane, at the silver fox. Is it you? He asked. Are you the one deciding what I can and cannot show? The fox's eyes opened. Aldrich froze. The silver fox, which had been a carved decoration for 40 years, which had never moved, never breathed, never shown any sign of life, looked directly at him with eyes that gleamed like actual silver. It nodded once, then closed its eyes and returned to sleep. Ah, said Aldrich, very quietly. I see. He would need to figure this out himself then, without the help of trainers or guidebooks or well-meaning strangers. He was contemplating his next move when something appeared on the ground in front of him. A book. It simply materialized, leather-bound and old, sitting on the forest floor as though it had always been there. Aldrich bent to pick it up, and as he reached for it, he thought, I should like to sit down. The ground opened beneath him. He had just enough time to register alarm before a chair rose up from the earth, a comfortable wingback in burgundy leather, and caught him neatly as he sat. Good heavens, Aldrich muttered. He reached to his side, half expecting, and a small table emerged from the ground, like a plant growing in extreme time-lapse. On it sat a teapot. His mental butler informed him it contained Earl Grey, and a plate of sweet cakes that looked suspiciously like the ones his local bakery in London had made. Aldrich poured himself a cup of tea with slightly shaking hands, took a cake, and bit into it. It tasted exactly right. He was conjuring furniture and tea, and somehow the book in his lap. He opened it. The handwriting inside was immediately familiar. Uncle Septimus's cramped, precise script. If you are reading this, the first page began, then you have inherited more than a cane. Aldrich read. The book detailed everything. Answered knock, also called threshold courtesy in older texts. The ability to open doors to anywhere, any physical location, any abstract space, any threshold that could be conceptualized, the hat that served as an item box, storing things in folded space, and more, things Aldrich hadn't discovered yet. The power to summon what was needed, provided one asked politely, the ability to create temporary spaces, comfortable and safe, the knack for understanding what things were and what they could do. These gifts, Uncle Septimus had written, do not advertise themselves. They are quiet powers, meant for the individual, not the crowd. The fox knows this. Trust it. Aldrich read through the afternoon and into early evening, absorbing everything his uncle had learned and recorded. By the time he finished, the light was fading and the forest was growing dim. He closed the book and set it on the table. Immediately, both book and table sank back into the earth, leaving only undisturbed grass and a stone that looked as though it had always been there. When he stood, the chair descended similarly, vanishing as though it had never existed. Aldrich looked around. He was in a forest. He'd forgotten entirely about the pigs, and he had nowhere to sleep for the night. He thought about what he wanted, a cottage, somewhere comfortable, with a view of the sunrise. Nothing too elaborate, just a proper place to rest. He tapped his cane against the ground. The world rotated. There was no other way to describe it, as though he was standing still while reality turned beneath him like a great wheel. The forest blurred, the sky wheeled, and when everything settled, he was standing on something very high up indeed, a stone pillar to be precise. Several miles above the ground, jutting from the landscape like a needle. And beside him, as though it had always been there, sat a small cottage with windows that glowed warmly in the gathering dark. Stars were beginning to emerge overhead, different constellations than London had, different patterns entirely. Aldrich walked to the cottage door and let himself in. The interior was exactly what he would have designed if asked. Comfortable furniture, warm lighting, everything in its proper place. A hat rack stood by the door, and as he hung his top hat on it, he could have sworn it shifted slightly, as though settling itself to hold the weight just right. He placed his cane on one of the rack's arms, and it too seemed to nestle into place. In the kitchen, for there was a kitchen, a pot of tea sat waiting, something herbal and calming, with just a touch of honey. Aldrich poured himself a cup and sipped it. Exhaustion hit him like a wave. He'd been running on adrenaline and bewilderment for 2 days now, and his body was politely but firmly informing him that it required sleep. He made his way to the bedroom, undressed, and climbed into a bed that was somehow even more comfortable than the one he'd left in London. As he drifted towards sleep, his last conscious thought was a simple one. What will tomorrow bring? The cottage, the pillar, and the stars outside offered no answer. But somewhere, very faintly, he thought he heard the silver fox chuckle. Chapter 3, in which the fox plays by its own rules. Aldrich woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, which was pleasant, if somewhat alarming, given that he'd gone to sleep alone in a cottage several miles above the ground. He sat up, noted that his clothes, which he'd draped over a chair, looked and smelled freshly laundered, and decided that questioning these things too early in the morning would only lead to existential confusion before breakfast. The kitchen table by the window held a plate of hotcakes, eggs, bacon, and sausage, arranged exactly as he'd preferred them during his years working in America. Beside it sat a cup of coffee, prepared precisely the way he'd always taken it, 2 sugars, a splash of cream. Aldrich sat down, watched the sunrise paint the sky in colours that were almost but not quite the ones he remembered, and ate breakfast while considering his day. He had 4 pigs to hunt. The quest gave him 48 hours, which seemed generous for something that should take perhaps an afternoon. The question was whether his abilities would cooperate with hunting animals the way they'd failed with demonstrating to people. A thought occurred to him, something he'd read somewhere, though he couldn't quite place where. The guild bought almost anything: pelts, meat, materials from dangerous creatures. If he could manage it, perhaps something larger than pigs would be worth the effort. A bear, for instance. The idea was ridiculous, of course. He'd never hunted anything in his life. But if his abilities worked on animals... He finished his coffee, retrieved his top hat and cane, and stepped outside. The morning sun was warm, and his clothes, now mysteriously clean, felt comfortable against his skin. He didn't dwell on how that had happened. Some mysteries, he was learning, were better accepted than examined. He approached the edge of the stone pillar and looked down. He couldn't see the ground. Clouds obscured everything below, and the sheer distance made his head swim slightly. He stepped back, gripped his cane more firmly, and thought about where he wanted to go. Back to the forest, a bit deeper in. Somewhere bears might reasonably be found. He tapped the ground. The world rotated beneath him, that same stomach-turning sensation of reality wheeling like a great mechanism, and when it settled, he was standing at the forest's edge. Trees stretched away into green shadow, and the air smelled of pine and something musky. Not far ahead, perhaps 50 yards into the trees, something large and brown was foraging. Aldrich's mental butler helpfully supplied. Brown bear, omnivore, territorial, highly dangerous. Threat level, severe. The bear noticed him. It stood on its hind legs, easily 8 feet tall, and made a sound somewhere between a roar and a question. Aldrich gripped his cane by its lower end, bringing the silver fox head down to ground level. He had an idea. It was probably mad, but then again, everything about the past few days had been mad. He tapped the ground with the fox's nose. In his mind, very clearly, he thought, "Open a door 100 feet directly above me." The bear charged. It covered the distance with terrifying speed, paws thundering against the forest floor, teeth bared. Aldrich stood very still. The bear hit the invisible threshold, a door in the air that simply hadn't been there a moment before, and vanished. The ground in front of Aldrich sealed itself. He looked up. A brown bear was falling from the sky, tumbling and roaring, its trajectory precisely calculated to bring it back to the exact spot where it had been moments before. It hit the ground with a sound like a sack of wet cement being dropped from a significant height. Aldrich waited a moment, then approached cautiously. The bear was quite dead. "Good Lord," he said quietly. "That actually worked." He stared at the carcass, then at his hat. The bear was far too large to fit inside it, surely. But then again, the hat had held 12 flowers without showing any sign of occupation, and Uncle Septimus's book had suggested the space inside was flexible. He removed his hat and placed it on the bear's head. "Store," he said, feeling only slightly ridiculous. The bear collapsed in on itself like a deflating balloon and vanished into the hat, which showed no change in weight or appearance. Aldrich put the hat back on his head. "How much room," he asked aloud, "do I actually have in there?" The hat, wisely, did not answer. He made his way downhill toward the meadows where pigs might reasonably be found. The quest specified 4 wild pigs, probably the sort that rooted through farmers' fields and made general nuisances of themselves. He spotted them after about 20 minutes of walking, a small group of bristled, pig-shaped creatures rooting in the grass about 100 yards distant. Aldrich stopped and considered the problem. If he approached, they'd scatter. They were fast, and he was decidedly not equipped for a chase. But if he could open doors beneath the bear while it was running toward him... He tapped his cane against the ground and thought very specifically, 4 doors, 1 beneath each pig. Exit point, 2 miles straight up. The pigs continued rooting, oblivious. Then, simultaneously, they all dropped through the earth as though it had suddenly remembered gravity worked downward. Aldrich looked up, shaded his eyes, and waited. Several seconds later, 4 pig-shaped objects appeared in the sky, falling with increasing velocity. They hit the ground about 15 feet in front of him, one after another, with wet thuds. "Well," Aldrich said, "that's efficient, if somewhat unsporting." He stored all 4 pigs in his hat, which was becoming concerningly full of dead animals, and considered his next move. He should return to the guild, turn in the quest, sell the bear, collect his payment. He thought about the guild hall, about Helena's desk, about standing in front of it to complete his transaction. He tapped the ground. The world rotated, and suddenly, without warning, without the usual sense of passage, he was standing directly in front of Helena's counter. Inside the guild hall, with at least 30 adventurers staring at him in complete silence, Helena's mouth had fallen open. Marcus and Elaine, sitting at a nearby table with coffee, had frozen mid-conversation. Aldrich blinked. From his perspective, it had felt like the rotation, reality turning beneath him while he stood still. But clearly, from everyone else's perspective, he had simply appeared, like a teleportation spell, which, according to the expressions around him, was not something people did casually. "I've got the pigs," Aldrich said, because he couldn't think of anything else to say, "as well as a bear I'd like to sell." Helena's voice came out slightly strangled. "Where did you come from? How did you do that? Are you a wizard?" Aldrich stared at her. "A wizard?" The word meant something from fantasy novels and children's stories, but not in any practical sense that applied to him. "I?" He trailed off, genuinely uncertain how to explain. The entire hall had gone silent. Everyone was staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to awe to what might have been fear. A man behind another counter, one marked Materials and Buyback, cleared his throat. "I can take any animals you've got, sir, if you'd come this way." Aldrich followed him gratefully into a back room, away from the stairs. The man gestured to a large wooden table. "Just set them out here, and we'll assess the value." Aldrich removed his hat and held it over the table. He tried to think of the right word. Release. The silver fox apparently approved, because all 4 pigs tumbled out onto the table, followed by the bear, which landed with a heavy thump that made the wood creak. The man's eyebrows rose. "Interesting. You have a bottomless hat. I've heard of bottomless bags, but never a bottomless hat." "Magic hat," Aldrich's mental butler supplied. "Storage capacity, extensive. Classification, rare artifact." So that's what it was called here, a magic hat. The man examined the animals, making notes on a piece of paper. 4 pigs, good condition. 1 brown bear, adult male, pelt intact. I can give you 60 silver for the lot. "That would be acceptable, thank you." The transaction completed, Aldrich returned to the main hall. Helena had recovered enough to process his quest completion, handing him the 20 silver pieces for the pig hunt. He placed all the coins into his hat, along with the small pouch he'd been wearing at his belt. Everything fit with room to spare, and keeping his money somewhere that didn't exist seemed considerably safer than carrying it openly. The stairs continued as he made his way toward the exit. He caught fragments of whispered conversation, teleported right in front of. Spatial magic, has to be. That young? Impossible. Who is he? Aldrich stepped out into the street and took a breath of relatively normal air. He needed to do some shopping. Basic supplies, perhaps some proper adventuring equipment if he was going to continue this. And he should probably find lodging in town. Something about the cottage, as comfortable as it had been, felt slightly wrong. Too easy, too perfectly matched to his wants. Staying in town, with other people around, seemed like a better idea. He headed toward what appeared to be the shopping district, very aware of the way people were beginning to look at him, like he was something powerful. Like he was a wizard, whatever that actually meant. The silver fox, sleeping peacefully against his palm, offered no comment on the matter. Aldrich suspected it was laughing at him. Chapter 3, in which geography becomes a matter of courtesy. Part 2. The shopping district of Lorendale proved to be a pleasant maze of storefronts and market stalls, offering everything from enchanted trinkets to practical housewares. Aldrich wandered between them, hands clasped behind his back, and discovered a peculiar problem. He had no idea what to buy. Everything he'd needed so far had simply appeared. Tea when he wanted it, breakfast when he woke, clean clothes while he slept. The cottage itself had manifested fully furnished. It was all terribly convenient and simultaneously rather unsettling. What did one purchase when one's needs were met by ambient magic and a top hat with questionable spatial properties? He was contemplating a display of leather traveling bags, which seemed redundant given his circumstances, when 2 men in polished armor collided with him from behind. Aldrich stumbled forward slightly, caught himself with his cane, and turned. "My apologies, he began. Both men had gone absolutely white. They were knights, clearly. Their armor bore the crest of some order or another, all crossed swords and laurel wreaths, and they were now staring at Aldrich with expressions of absolute horror. "My lord," one of them gasped, dropping to one knee. "Forgive us, we didn't see. We would never presume to." "I'm not a lord," Aldrich said, confused. The knights exchanged a glance. The second one, still kneeling, looked up at him more carefully. His expression shifted from mortification to suspicion. "You're not noble?" "Decidedly not. I'm a retired accountant from London." The first knight stood slowly. "A commoner, dressed like that." "Is there a law against dressing well?" Aldrich asked, though a sinking feeling was beginning to form in his stomach. "As a matter of fact," the second knight said, his voice hardening, "impersonating nobility is a crime in Lorendale, punishable by imprisonment and fine." "I'm not impersonating anyone. These are simply my clothes." But the knights had already decided. One of them produced a pair of iron manacles from his belt, while the other grabbed Aldrich's arms with practiced efficiency. "You'll come with us. The magistrate can sort this out." The cuffs clicked shut around Aldrich's wrists. One knight confiscated his top hat, the other his cane, and both items were placed in a small wooden box. "This is a misunderstanding," Aldrich protested, but he was already being marched toward a wagon, a prison wagon, he realized, complete with iron bars. They threw him inside with less courtesy than they'd shown initially, locked the door, and attached the box containing his belongings to the driver's seat. The wagon lurched into motion. Aldrich sat on the hard bench and took stock. He was handcuffed, his tools were confiscated, and he was being taken to face charges for the crime of owning nice clothing. All things considered, this was not his finest hour. He looked at the iron bars, then down at his manacled hands. The cuffs were connected by a short chain, giving him perhaps 6 inches of movement. Almost without thinking, operating purely on panicked instinct, he reached out and tapped the back of one bar with his knuckle. "I wish I had the key," he whispered. A tiny door appeared in the iron bar. Not visible, exactly, but present. He could feel the threshold of it, the space between locked and unlocked. Through it, something small and metal dropped into his palm. A key. Aldrich stared at it, then glanced toward the front of the wagon. Both knights were facing forward, discussing something about duty rosters. He fumbled the key into the lock behind his back, which was considerably harder than it sounded, and after several attempts, heard the satisfying click of the manacles opening. One of the knights turned, saw the key in Aldrich's hand, patted his belt where several keys hung, and came up one short. "How did you?" Aldrich tapped the ceiling of the cage. "I'd really like my hat and cane back." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a door opened inside a door. The wooden box at the driver's seat opened from within, and his top hat and cane simply slid out through impossible geometry. They appeared through a small gap in the cage bars, as though squeezed through a space far too narrow for them, and Aldrich caught them gratefully. "Stop the wagon!" the first knight shouted. Aldrich tapped the floor of the cage with his cane. "Take me back to where they found me." The world shifted. From Aldrich's perspective, reality rotated sideways, a nauseating lurch that deposited him elsewhere with stomach-churning efficiency. From the knight's perspective, he simply vanished in a small puff of displaced air. "Sorcerer!" one of them shouted. "He's a bloody sorcerer!" But Aldrich didn't hear them. He was too busy processing the fact that he was sitting in water, warm water, in what appeared to be a marble bathing pool, next to a young woman who was decidedly unclothed. She screamed. Aldrich scrambled backward in the water, sputtering. "This is not where I meant to go. I'm terribly sorry." He slapped his hand against the water's surface. "Take me where I actually wanted to go." The world shifted again, mercifully fast. Behind him, he heard the thunder of boots, shouts of alarm, the sound of armed men bursting into the bathhouse. But he was already gone. He landed, dripping wet, in the middle of the shopping district, exactly where the knights had first accosted him. Several shoppers stared at him, a soaked gentleman in fine clothes, holding a top hat and cane, standing in a puddle of bathwater. "Good afternoon," Aldrich said weakly. He squelched his way toward what appeared to be a clothier's shop. What Aldrich did not know, could not have known, was the chaos he'd left behind in the palace. 13 palace guards had heard the princess scream. They'd heard a man's voice inside the bathhouse, apologizing, of all things, and they'd burst through the doors with weapons drawn. The bathhouse was empty, save for the princess, sitting in the water, screaming. No man, no intruder, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. The king, presented with this information, had faced an impossible choice. believe that his daughter had imagined a man appearing in her bath, or believe that 13 of his guards were lying about what they'd heard. He chose the latter. All 13 were executed that afternoon for dereliction of duty and bearing false witness. Aldrich, purchasing a new set of clothes that were slightly less ostentatiously nice than his usual attire, knew nothing of this. The clothier was helpful, if somewhat concerned about his waterlogged state. Aldrich purchased a simpler coat, trousers, and shirt, still well made, but less likely to scream nobility at casual observation. He changed in the shop's back room, placed his wet clothes in his hat, where they vanished without complaint, and emerged feeling slightly more grounded. His stomach growled. He found a tavern, the Copper Kettle, and ordered what the server recommended: sizzling meat with herbs, a large loaf of bread that tasted remarkably like garlic bread without the garlic butter, and a tall glass of ale. The ale was a revelation. He'd never been much for beer, but this was smooth and rich and somehow exactly right. The food was excellent. The music, a lute player in the corner, was pleasant. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming. Aldrich sat in his corner booth, eating slowly, and thought, "I could live here forever." The words settled into his mind with a weight he didn't quite recognize. At the bar, his cane, which he'd propped against the table, shifted slightly. The silver fox raised its head, looked directly at him, and nodded once. Then it returned to sleep. Aldrich was too focused on his meal to notice. He found an inn as evening fell, the wayward traveller, and paid for a room with some of his newly earned silver. The room was simple but clean: a bed, a washstand, a small table by the window. Aldrich sat at the table and thought, idly, "I would love a cup of tea." A small opening appeared in the table's surface, wood simply folding away like curtains, and a teapot emerged. Hot, ready, smelling of Earl Grey. 2 cups accompanied it, along with a tray of sweet cakes and fried pastries dusted with powdered sugar. A small pot of raspberry jam sat beside them, complete with a tiny silver spoon. Aldrich stared at the spread, then carefully poured himself tea. The sweet cakes were perfect. The jam was exactly the right tartness. The tea was precisely the correct temperature. He ate and drank slowly, watching the unfamiliar stars appear outside his window, and thought about everything that had happened. He'd escaped from prison by knocking on bars. He'd accidentally teleported into a princess's bath. He'd somehow, without meaning to, condemned 13 men to death, though he didn't know it. And he'd said, quite clearly, that he could live here forever. The fox had nodded. Aldrich wasn't certain what that meant, but something about it felt significant in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He finished his tea, changed into the nightshirt that had mysteriously appeared in the wardrobe, and climbed into bed. His last thought before sleep was simple and genuine. "I can't wait to see what happens tomorrow." Outside, the stars continued their unfamiliar patterns. The silver fox slept on. And somewhere in the palace, a king mourned 13 loyal guards while his daughter tried to explain that yes, there really had been a man in her bath, and no, she wasn't mad. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, Aldrich Pemberton slept soundly, dreaming of doors and thresholds, and the peculiar magic of knowing exactly where one wanted to go. Chapter 3, in which geography becomes a matter of courtesy. Part 3. Aldrich woke to find that the inn-room had taken certain liberties with his breakfast expectations. The table by the window, which had produced tea the night before, now held a full English breakfast. Eggs, bacon, sausage, grilled tomatoes, mushrooms, black pudding, and toast with butter and marmalade. A fresh pot of tea steamed gently beside a folded newspaper. The newspaper was the most alarming part. It was written in English, proper London English, and the masthead read The Laurendale Observer, a gentleman's digest of current affairs. Aldrich sat down slowly and unfolded it. The front page story made his tea go cold in his mouth. 13 palace guards executed for false testimony. In an unprecedented move, His Majesty King Aldous III ordered the immediate execution of 13 palace guards yesterday afternoon, following an incident in the royal bathhouse. The guards claimed to have heard an intruder's voice alongside Her Highness Princess Celestine's screams, but upon investigation, no such intruder was found. The sanctity of the royal family cannot be compromised by flights of fancy or coordinated deception, declared the King's Chancellor. These men failed in their most basic duty, truthful service. Princess Celestine, 18, was unavailable for comment. Palace sources suggest she remains distressed by the incident. Aldrich set the newspaper down with shaking hands. 13 men, dead, because he'd panicked and teleported incorrectly. He'd appeared in the princess's bath for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to realize his mistake, apologize, and leave. The guards had heard him. Of course they had, and they'd told the truth about what they'd heard. And they'd been executed for it. "Oh God," Aldrich whispered. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. His breakfast sat untouched as he paced the small room, cane gripped white-knuckled in his hand. This was his fault, directly, completely his fault. He'd been careless with powers he didn't understand, and 13 men had died because of it. The silver fox on his cane remained sleeping, offering no judgment and no comfort. Aldrich stopped pacing and stared at it. "You could have prevented this," he said quietly. "You control what I can and cannot do. You could have stopped me from appearing there." The fox didn't respond. "Or perhaps," Aldrich continued, his voice hardening, "you wanted me to learn a lesson. About consequences. About being careful." Still nothing. He sat back down at the table and forced himself to think rationally. He couldn't undo what had happened. The men were dead. Going to the palace to explain would likely result in his own execution, or worse, they might not believe him either, and more people would die. But he could be more careful. He could think before he acted. He could treat his abilities not as convenient party tricks, but as dangerous tools that required precision. He picked up the newspaper again and read the rest of it. There were other stories. A merchant dispute in the lower city, a dragon sighting in the northern mountains, dealt with by the Adventurers Guild, an upcoming festival celebrating the harvest. The weather forecast promised clear skies. Normal things, the world continuing as though 13 men hadn't just been killed for telling the truth. Aldrich folded the newspaper carefully and set it aside. He ate his breakfast mechanically, tasting nothing. The food was perfect, as always. That was almost worse, the universe providing for his comfort while ignoring the consequences of his actions. When he finished, he retrieved his top hat and placed it on his head. The hat, he'd learned, didn't just store things. It seemed to know things. It had produced a newspaper that shouldn't exist, written in a language this world didn't speak, containing information he needed to know. "Are you trying to teach me something?" he asked it aloud. The hat, unsurprisingly, offered no answer. He left the inn and stepped into the morning streets of Lorendale. The city was already busy. Merchants opening shops, adventurers heading to the guild, normal people going about their normal lives. Aldrich walked without particular direction, thinking. He'd said he could live here forever. The fox had nodded. Had that been permission? A contract? Or simply acknowledgement? And what did it mean that he had essentially decided to stay? He hadn't seriously considered trying to return to London. The thought of his empty flat, his cancelled dental appointment, his identical days stretching endlessly forward, it all seemed impossibly grey compared to this. Even with the guilt. Even with the knowledge that his carelessness had killed 13 men. Perhaps especially because of that. In London, nothing he did mattered much. He was retired, childless, his friends few and far between. He filled his days with crosswords and tea, and the occasional visit from Timothy. Here, apparently, his actions had weight. Terrible, lethal weight that he hadn't asked for and didn't want. But weight nonetheless. He found himself at the Adventurers Guild without meaning to. His feet had carried him there while his mind wandered. Helena looked up as he entered, and her expression was complicated, part curiosity, part wariness, part something that might have been respect. "Mr. Pemberton," she said carefully. "Back so soon?" "I was wondering," Aldrich said, "if there are any quests available that involve helping people, directly." Helena blinked. "Helping people?" "Yes, rather than hunting or gathering, something constructive." She shuffled through her papers. "There's a request from the orphanage. They need someone to repair their roof before winter. Doesn't pay much, just 30 silver, but the work's straightforward if you have carpentry skills." "I'll take it," Aldrich said immediately. "You want to repair a roof?" "I want to do something useful," Aldrich said quietly. "Something that doesn't result in anyone dying." Helena's expression softened slightly. She wrote out the quest details on a card and handed it to him. The orphanage is on Mercy Street, Eastern District. Sister Agnes runs it. Tell her the guild sent you." "Thank you, Miss Frost." Aldrich left the guild and made his way east through the city. The streets grew narrower, the buildings more worn. This was clearly a poorer district. Washing hung between buildings, children played in the streets, and the smell of industry hung in the air. The orphanage was a 3-story building that had seen better days. The roof was indeed in poor condition, several tiles missing, others cracked, and one section sagging ominously. Aldrich knocked on the front door. A woman in a nun's habit answered. Middle-aged, tired-looking, with kind eyes. "Sister Agnes? I'm from the Adventurers Guild. About your roof." Her face brightened. "Oh, thank heavens, come in, please. I'm afraid we can't pay much, but the payment is fine," Aldrich assured her. "I'm more interested in the work itself." He spent the rest of the morning examining the roof, and it became immediately clear that he had no idea how to repair it. He'd never done carpentry in his life. He was an accountant, not a builder, but he had other resources. He climbed down from his ladder and found a quiet corner of the orphanage's yard. Several children were playing nearby, but they were absorbed in their game. Aldrich tapped his cane against the ground and thought very specifically, "I need the tools and knowledge to repair this roof properly." A door opened in the air. Not large, just a small portal the size of a book. Through it fell a leather-bound manual, the complete guide to roof repair and maintenance. Aldrich caught it, opened it, and found it written in clear, practical English with detailed diagrams. He read for 20 minutes, absorbing information about joist placement, tile alignment, and proper sealing techniques. Then he tapped the ground again. "I need the materials: tiles, wood, nails, sealant." Another door opened, larger this time. Materials began appearing in neat stacks, everything he needed, perfectly organized. The children had stopped playing and were staring at him. "Are you a wizard, mister?" one of them asked. Aldrich considered this. "I'm a gentleman with a rather unusual cane," he said finally. "Would you like to help?" They did want to help, as it turned out. Children were excellent at handing up tiles and holding tools, even if they couldn't do the actual repair work. Aldrich spent the afternoon on the roof, following the manual's instructions with careful precision. His abilities seemed content to provide materials and knowledge, but required him to do the actual work himself, which seemed fair. By evening, the roof was repaired. Properly repaired, not just patched. Every tile aligned, every joint sealed, the whole structure sound and weatherproof. Sister Agnes came out to inspect it as the sun was setting. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, her voice thick with emotion, This is beautiful work, and you did it in one day." "I had excellent assistance," Aldrich said, nodding to the children who'd helped. "The guild said 30 silver, but this work is worth far more. If I could." 30 silver is perfect," Aldrich interrupted gently. "Consider the extra work a donation to the orphanage." Sister Agnes pressed the coins into his hand, then surprised him by hugging him tightly. "You're a good man," she whispered. "God bless you." Aldrich walked back through the darkening streets, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Useful. He'd helped. Directly, constructively, without causing any deaths or creating any disasters. He'd fixed a roof. It was small and simple, and exactly what had been needed. 13 men were still dead because of him. That guilt wouldn't fade. But perhaps he could balance it. One careful, helpful action at a time. He returned to the wayward traveller as night fell, climbed the stairs to his room, and found that the table had once again anticipated his needs. Tea, sweet cakes, and another newspaper. This one's headline read, "Mysterious Benefactor Repairs Orphanage. Sister Agnes Calls It a Miracle." Aldrich smiled despite himself, sat down with his tea, and began planning tomorrow. He would be more careful. He would think before acting. He would use his powers to help rather than harm. And perhaps, eventually, he would find a way to make amends for the 13 men who died telling the truth about what they'd heard. The silver fox on his cane opened one eye, looked at him, and went back to sleep. It might have been his imagination, but Aldrich thought it looked almost approving.